All right, we're now going to start. We will call the meeting of the school committee, finance committee meeting to order here at 8:10 a.m. Apologies for the late start here. Our first item of business is discussion with the town administrator and the select board finance committee on slide 7 budgets. With something you're going to screen share.
Sure, thank you. And I had shared some materials last night, which I belatedly realized slightly. So I pulled together a couple of things on the slide deck just to talk through where things stand. So I will do kind of a high level on the revenue side of where things stand and talk about where that leaves the overall budget based on shoulder requests. The level of detail, I'll defer to folks in the room. I don't know how much you want here or not. So where our revenue projections are, talked about them in a few different forums, but not necessarily this one. So here is a summary level of where the revenue outlook is today. I would focus on the subtotal line that shows a $4.9 million increase year over year at 3.42% as kind of what is available for spending for fiscal 27. I'll talk about the two items below the line in a moment. Again, just at a high level, this just pulls in where property taxes are under the limit of Prop 2.5. That assumes we raise the max that we can under the levy limit, which is the 2.5% increase over last year's levy, plus new growth. We have estimated $1 million. Local receipts, this is all of our fees and taxes that we collect locally. And I have a little bit more detail on those. We had initially had a 1% increase over fiscal 26. We revised that upwards by another percent, so we're about $10.45 million of local receipts. The next kind of check-in on that will be once our January motor vehicle excise commitment is prepared and ready. We'll reevaluate that forecast to see if we build a little bit further upwards revision. We don't expect any downwards revisions on any of these estimates at this time. Indirect costs is a small amount that's payments paid from the enterprise funds to the general fund for costs that we finance in the general fund. State aid we've kept where we've talked about pretty much all year long. There's really no major indications we have on state aid. In the next kind of touch point on that will be when the governor releases the fiscal 27 state budget, which we expect in a couple of weeks. Generally, the local aid information comes out around MMA, the Mass Municipal Association Annual Conference, which is 22nd, 23rd, 24th, I think. So that's a couple of weeks away. So we'll provide an update. That information is out publicly. So once that information is in, we'll provide it. And again, hopefully, we revise it upwards. Lastly, and this is a little bit of a change, just thinking about looking at the budget, I have shown here a contribution from the operating budget stabilization fund to the fiscal 27 budget. And just because looking at the numbers without it, it's an ominous number. It's an ominous number with or without it. But I felt it was important to show what that would look like with the withdrawal from that fund. And just as a reminder on that fund, this $700,000 was included in the override, so that's a recurring amount on the tax levy. Up to the select board to raise it by up to 2.5 each year. So anything over and above a $700,000 contribution from the operating budget stabilization fund would mean now we're pulling from non-recurring revenue sources. So I've used that as kind of an initial metric to just facilitate a budget that is a little bit more workable. And then other funds, it's a release from nowhere. It's not a significant amount. So the bottom line is the first time we talked about this in October, I think we were showing like a $4.2 million estimate year over year, or about a 3% increase with the additional funding resources from the operating budget stabilization fund that I feel to make a recommendation on. That brings a year over year increase to about 3.4, about right around $5 million. The lion's share, obviously, is the $3.8 million in tax levy. While we, as I mentioned, do expect some tweaks to this over the next month, I think we're talking a scale of couple $100,000 on the scale of millions. So just to kind of set expectations, any upwards revisions I wouldn't expect to be anywhere more than $100,000 or $200,000. So I feel that this is pretty much set in stone, and that any revisions would be upwards rather than downwards. The next couple of slides that I threw together just show this in a little bit more detail. I can pause there for any questions. For example, this is just to further summarize the property tax changes. As you can see there, the $2.8 million is from it's the allowable amount from 2.5% increase from last year's levy. New growth is at $1 million. This is another place I should note that we will revisit in the next month based on, so new growth is captured this fiscal year for fiscal 27. So the work that's being built right now will feed into the fiscal 27 new growth figure. And the assessors feel comfortable at $1 million estimate, but we'll check back in that office in the next month or two to get an updated sense as to where they expect that to land. We've kept that forecast in the $1 million range. Last year, we significantly exceeded it. And this, I've shown this slide before. This just shows our new growth history. As you can see, the last 3 or 4 years, we've been over $1 million, really over 1.2 million. But the history in Milton is to what is going on right now is if you're driving around town, the ice house on Blue Hills Parkway is officially online. That's basically fully captured, but then subsequent new growth additions and renovations folks are building. There's a new daycare being built on Blue Hill Ave, and then the 40 Peaks under construction, 5 are under construction at this time. And then 440 Granite Ave is all under construction. So that will be driving the growth for the next couple of years. So those units are fully 100% occupied, rented out, or sold. That they are.
Nick, can I just, so in terms of that, so to speak, new growth pipeline, right? Which I know is not like a thing, but I'm going to call it that for a minute, just to kind of get some perspective on what to see in these future years. So those other projects, the other 40Bs you're speaking of, are those going to be captured in new growth in the out years, or are they just going to roll back into the standard property tax base?
So for 26 new growth, a bunch of that is due to the ice house project. So that's one kind of fully rolled in.
That's hit. But
that's it. And it won't show up. That won't show up in new growth anymore. It's just now part of the base.
Yeah.
For 26 and beyond, or for next year and beyond, it's going to be 936 Brush Hill Road and 711 Randolph Ave, the two that are most along the way. So those will be a big portion of the new growth that we use for fiscal 27, and then less for 28. But then 582 Cable Ave and East Milton projects will fill in for 28 and then kind of be dissipating. So I think for 27 to 28, we should have some decent growth, no matter what else happens, just through those projects that will be constructed.
Mm-hmm.
But a third of our new growth on an annual basis is the utility growth from Eversource and National Grid based on the work they do. So if that pipeline slows down, it's a great conversation that are going elsewhere that can have an impact on us. And then just the trend of renovating homes and building additions, if the economy starts to get more challenging, that slows down. So while the large projects are a contributor, they're not the sole contributor. And while we can rely on them for a year or two, there are other aspects that we don't have 100%.
And we don't have a strong pipeline, so to speak, of these types of projects coming in.
No, that's correct.
And there's risk because of the potential recession.
Correct. And these large projects, which if you go and talk about local receipts, you'll see it in the building permit revenue, where the last couple of years building permits have been extremely high. But again, after the last large project that is not fully, that doesn't have a building permit, it's not 100% approved to go forward, is the 648, 652 Canton Ave. So that's a large one, that's 116 unit project. But everything else is been permitted from a building permit perspective. So those permit fees have been paid. And then from a new growth perspective, we started to capture a little bit of 26, and then 27 and 28 will be the rest of it. And then after that, there's really not a significant project as of today in the pipeline. So
So I just wanted to make sure we were highlighting that so you can understand the risk in the out years.
Correct. The good thing is for 26, as an example, we had kept that forecast at $1 million, came in at $5 million. So that all that means is now, rather than a base of $1 million each year, that's 1.5. That's another $500,000 that we have forever in terms of tax. I alluded to the local receipts a bit, so we revised that projection upwards. You can see the history going back to, fiscal 20 here. Motor vehicle. So there are a lot of outliers in terms of the past couple of years. Draw attention to motor vehicle excise, building permits, and then interest or investment income. We spent a decent amount of time talking about this with the Budget Coordination Committee. And the reluctance that we have to push these forecasts too much is because we attribute a lot of the $13.5 million that was brought in last year to one-time expenses motor vehicle. If you look at the monthly revenue for motor vehicle excise tax fiscal 25, every month was significantly above prior years. And talking to the treasurer, she was working with our deputy collector to make sure that the work that we need to do to capture those new vehicle excise payments is done. So we think a significant amount of that is just to getting back on track of collection. Penalties and interest, you can see a spike there in fiscal 25. There was a number of redemptions on property tax, long-standing, outstanding property tax bills. I think it was upwards of $900,000 was paid in fiscal 25 that had been older payments. So that contributes to a spike in penalties and interest. We talked about building permits already. You can see where the large projects come in. 582 Global Lab, which was permitted this year, so it's in fiscal 26 revenue. It's an 84 unit project, but the permit fee was upwards of $300,000. So those single permits can have a significant impact on a single year's revenue. The other one, just to note, that has jumped was the trash and recycling fees in 25, and we did increase the trash fee by $1 to $4 a week. The stickers are now $4, so we feel comfortable with revising that projection upwards based on the new kind of baseline revenue expectations there. As I noted, we expect to revisit this once we have the next large commitment on motor vehicle excise. I wouldn't expect significant swings in this upwards, but maybe a further addition local receipts.
Nick, is the column recap, is that like a reforecast of what we expect for this year? Is that what that means?
Yeah, sorry. So that matches what we used for the fiscal 25 budget. Recap means what we submitted to the Department of Revenue before the tax rate is set. So that means that's locked in as our final revenue forecast, but it matches what we included in the warrant for fiscal 26's budget at the time. Yeah. Sliding over to expense. I don't have a state aid slide only because I think it's out of our hands really. And we'll have more information coming in the next weeks on that.
But we're not, sorry.
Before we leave revenue, so is all the revenue that we are seeing right now revenue that you anticipated in when you were back in March, April, May, June, when you were getting ready to close out, and when we were in the town was projecting into 26? So what we're seeing right now, is this what you thought it would be?
Like the budget to actual on revenue for fiscal 25 or. So
we're about to talk about expenses, but before we talk about expenses, I just wanted, like, when people were together talking about FY 26 and FY 27 in an override being voted, was this the ballpark of where we thought we would be with other revenue in addition to what the contribution would be toward the override?
Yes. So this $10.25 million that we get included in the 25 budget was our baseline revenue expectation. We didn't have a higher number at all when we were forecasting out the next 5 years. On the property tax front, the only thing that's different in terms of how we've talked about the override was, and No, and this was the baseline expectation. State aid is higher than we had budgeted at. We had higher than anticipated state aid in 2026 than we included in those projections at the first go round. And then when we talked about what the next several years would look like, we expected fully withdrawing the $2.7 million, or I'm sorry, fully utilizing the operating budget stabilization fund in fiscals 27, 28, 29, and 30 to get through the next couple of fiscal years at around a 3% expense growth. So if budgets came in between 2.5% and 3% with full utilization of the operating stabilization fund, we felt that was manageable for the next several fiscal years. And
So that's the 700.
that's $700,000. And in our initial, I look back at our initial take on that is when fiscal 27, we anticipated about an $860,000 withdrawal rather than a $700,000 withdrawal. But for this conversation, I've kept it at what is recurring rather than anything that would be kind of further one-time infusion out of that fund.
Nick, I have one other revenue question.
Sure.
The state aid is at a 1% increase, forecasted increase of 1% for FY27. You said it was more than that in the jump from 25 to 26. I'm assuming historically a 1% increase in state aid is low. Or, can you just provide some context there?
Yes and no. So after the Student Opportunity Act amended Milton. So when the Student Opportunity Act was put in place, the state also put additional resources into Chapter 70. So Milton benefited significantly in a couple of years. I don't have it here, but we do have a slide that shows there were a couple of spike years, like 21 and 22, where state aid jumped significantly. But I think the historic trend is it's more in the 1 to 3% range. And the other thing to think about too is while we do get, this just shows the receipts, we do have assessments that we owe the state. So we really try to talk about it more in a net state aid perspective. Because our assessments can jump from year to year. So when you think about it more in the net state aid, I think we're netting out a 1 to 2% gain each year. The Mass Municipal Association has put out a couple of research papers around Prop 2.5 and other issues, and they've tagged state aid as a place where they're going to try to exert some additional legislative pressure because if you go all the way back to like 2008, 2009 after the financial crisis, state aid was deeply cut, and we've never really gotten back to those levels. So it's not been. There have been years where it's been a significant revenue increase for the town. But we don't expect it to be in the near term anymore unless some of that calculation changes.
And there's not an expectation for a major increase or no discussion at this time that there's going to be some special factor.
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
That I've heard anything of. Like I said, usually it's the announcement around the annual conference. I think we're all a little concerned about the state budget generally as federal impacts are being felt. So I think I wouldn't even say I'm cautiously optimistic. I think we're just hopeful for
funding.
Yeah, at least an increase, at least a 1% increase that I expect to happen, and anything above that. And then I think thinking out beyond fiscal 27 as we start to see the cuts to Medicaid that aren't in effect yet, but will be in effect in future years, that exert even greater pressure on the state budget. So beyond 27, concerns around how the state budget will be. Let's go. So what we have used so just style back. So 159, 16, 643 number is what we're using as the revenue available for fiscal 27. I noted that below the line of free cash, special purpose debt stabilization fund. So while that was revenue that we use in 26, we're not including right now any free cash in the budget as a revenue source, or have we funded any items in the expense side of the budget free cash yet. So the budget now doesn't have capital in it. Also haven't brought in free cash to fund any one-time items that might be within the budgets elsewhere that would alleviate some pressure. So, there was free cash appropriations last year to stabilization funds for capital. That's why it just looks a little funky. So I wanted to flag that. But the bottom line number is the 159.16. If we bring in any free cash into the budget, if there are one-time costs that we can attribute to the revenue would increase with that free cash.
So, well, with that comment, are we saying that it's already decided that free cash will not be used to support ongoing operating budgets, given the 2.1 reduction to the schools?
We have a financial policy that has recently been adopted that would say that free cash will not be used for recurring sources. What we talked about in those meetings was we have the operating budget stabilization fund. So if more is withdrawn from that, free cash could be used to replenish that for use in future years. And it's, we put in place the sped stabilization fund last year at town meeting and adopted that statute. We didn't put any funding into it. So free cash could be used to put money into that. So there are places we could use free cash that wouldn't go directly into the operating budget that might support expenses and mitigate impacts. So this shows a summary of our costs for fiscal 27 based on town and school departmental level service requests, as well as where our shared costs are. Town departments are at 3.65 year over year. Blue Hills is just an estimate and a placeholder. So if that number is less, then that's cost savings. If the enrollment has jumped, then it costs us more, then we have to make that up elsewhere. And we just got to work to finalize that forecast with Blue Hills. They usually don't provide the information until late February. Health insurance has been a significant cost pressure. Last year, the premium increase was 14%. The overall health insurance budget in fiscal 26 went up 20%. We had to reset for an increased enrollment last year. So far for this year, the total enrollment number has been flat. We're seeing more family plans and individual plans than we anticipated, so a little bit of a pressure there. But by and large, enrollment has been flat. So most of the pressure on the health insurance budget is for premium increases. We're anticipating a 10% premium increase at this point. That premium increase would be higher, but there's been changes in the market to what the carriers are covering that would drop coverage for certain pharmaceuticals that would bring our anticipated increase down to 10%. I will note that that's based on year to date through November. So it's early to nail down a health insurance number. If claims trend better than they're tracking, the number could be less. But if claims trend worse, look at coming back to say that 10% needs to be higher. So I caution where that stands. And it's such a big cost item. Every 1% premium increase is about $40,000 of additional costs. So to go even from a 10% to a 12%, that's $300,000 we need to find.
When does that number get locked in, Nick?
Generally, we try to hold off until really February or March. We try to get like 7 or 8 months of claims if we can, claims information in. Milton is self-insured, so we pay the claims based on rates set by the Blue Cross and Department of Children. So in years of low utilization and low cost, we do really well, and we can have a very minimal increase. But so with skyrocketing costs and higher utilization, that puts direct pressure on the health trusts that is financed by the town budget. The other shared costs, I'll just run through those. Pension, our retirement system is fully funded, so minimal increases year over year there. OPEB, that's in keeping with our OPEB policy to invest 2.5. That keeps with our OPEB policy. I can describe that in more detail if folks would like. Debt service, we have a spike in debt service. And I think I talked about this almost here in October. A lot of our projects that have been financed or approved by town meeting several years ago, there have just been delays and delays. So rather than these projects coming online gradually, we're seeing a place where we could have several $1 million worth of significant projects that were approved by town meeting in 22 and 23 that are in the 27 budget. A ladder truck, fire engine, lower guile, and then the large project that's coming in, Polytonic for the National Space Library. It is a place where we are working to further refine that, and maybe we can extract some savings out of. But that should be like the high water mark of debt service. The rest are pretty straightforward. And so where that leaves us is with the revenue projection that I mentioned, about a $2.5 million gap to make up in fiscal 27. So what I then also did is just, what does a balanced budget look like from where we're sitting today? So if town and schools go up 2.38% with the revenue that we have, that's how we get to a balanced budget of $1,600 left over. So that's a $2 million reduction on where the school requests are, $414,000 reduction where the town requests are. So that's the the mitigation. The only other mitigation would be if we're able to revise revenues further, we're able to drive down any of these shared costs, expenses. And then Lessa, just know kind of what our next steps are. So we're working with departments. We have a department head meeting at 10 o'clock today, where we'll be talking with department heads about what we're asking them to go do in terms of to try to identify some reductions. I already have, and Amy and I have already talked about places where we feel some budgets can take some reductions. We're going to work to do a final revenue forecast later this month, early February, just to wrap in final new growth, review those local receipts one last time, and then incorporate the state aid numbers from the governor's budget. Discussion points will include how we're going to use free cash. Are there one-time costs in our budgets that, whether school budget or town budget, that can be financed with free cash to offset pressure on that aren't recurring? That would open up tax levy and other support for those recurring costs. And then we have $4.5 million in free cash. We've appropriated only 60,000 of it so far for the special election. So how we're going to put that free cash to use. Right now, we're earmarking $1 million to $1.2 million for the capital budget, as we have been doing for the last couple of years. We need to make a contribution to the general stabilization fund to meet our policy of 5% of the budget being in the general stabilization fund. That's going to be about, depending on how that fund does this year and the market, anywhere between $500,000 to $700,000. I would expect that appropriation need to be. And then the rest of it would be available for appropriation from there. And other options would be into the operating budget stabilization fund for future years, to the sped stabilization fund to support outstanding special education and transportation costs. And then lastly, we're just going to continue to track where health insurance is going. And hopefully things stay kind of on trend where they've been year to date. But that's just a big variable that I would worry about in terms of the budget. Everything else I feel like is decently locked in, and adjustments would be to the benefit rather than to the detriment.
Yeah, can I ask you a question about free cash?
Yep.
So 4.5 minus the amount for the election, minus 1.2 for capital, minus 600 for general stabilization. Is it the select board and your intention? Do you have to expend the whole 4.5 and put it into certain buckets, or does it stay in you?
No, we don't have a free cash policy that dictates how free cash is used necessarily. The financial policy sets aside 10% of free cash as well to just remain unappropriated. So that's the only kind of real change that's been dictated by the financial policy. So $450,000 would leave free cash for next year. But otherwise, what you believe is correct, and there's no other additional kind of requirements on how it be used beyond that.
So if it wasn't put in the operating, the stabilization fund for operating or special education, it would sit somewhere.
Correct. It would just be unappropriated at that point. we have one-time costs in the fiscal 27 budget, for example, that, we have some one-time employee costs that we could attribute to free cash. And feel comfortable with that. That's, a one-time expense rather, right? So like that would be, the other place on the top of mind. And then the one thing will mention is we have, a little convoluted, but our fiscal 26 budget includes cost of collective bargaining agreements.
Mhm.
If we don't reach agreements with the unions, then we won't pay out that money. So we could have a significant amount of money that is unspent in fiscal 26 that would generate free cash for fiscal 27. But what that would mean is then we're going to have a one-time payment in 27 for retro payments. So we might need to set aside some of the free cash depending on the progress we make with collective bargaining agreements, which has been slow on our end. And I know it's more typical for the schools to have those done on time.
Mhm.
Ours have lags. And in the last cycle, we had to do that in one fiscal year because we didn't reach it within that first year. So all of our agreements expired on June 30th of 25. So all of the unions are in negotiations at this time.
Just to carry on John's point, so generally doing that math of free cash, 4.5 million, and the budget's kind of John laid out, an additional 450 as you commission the policy lays out. That leaves about $2 million additional free cash to figure out how to use that to mitigate. And again, find other places where there are not recurring impacts. So this might be about the projection for FY27.
Correct.
And also we spent a lot of time this fall talking about revenue, and it really never was clear to me until recently that the assumption back in the spring and then through the summer was that this was all predicated on a 3% increase in expenses. So with that information being brought to our attention, recently, do we all feel like that's a reasonable framework to move forward from for the school department or other departments to only grow at 3%? Is that a reasonable pathway? That fiscally, Jimmy, educationally, we can talk about the damage that can be put in place, but fiscally, do we actually think that's a reasonable framework?
I think we can debate the definition of reasonable and what is just the situation that we're in.
So with 3% in $2 million will reduce 26 staff members by the end of this year.
Yeah.
And then when we come back the following year and we have to meet a 3% expectation, we'll reduce another 15 to 20. And then the following year, we'll finally get to that point where we're small enough to be able to try to navigate a 3% budget when our steps and lanes for a reduced amount of folks will be a less number that it'll be very hard for a school department to get to a 3% annual expectation, given how 81% of our budget is structured around union employees that already have structures in place that just steps and lanes alone is almost 2.something%. So I really would like to be a thought partner in this discussion of this annual 3% model, and how if that is the model that we're holding true, and there's no more revenue coming in,
Right.
There's no override coming for another 7 years. So I understand that. But the reason why I asked the question earlier about did we understand this to be our total revenue package walking into the fiscal year, with a potential of now knowing, understanding that this is based on a 3% increase, that framework will result in reductions to the school department for the next 3 to 5 years. And I don't know if that's exactly what people were thinking or from a variety.
Yeah, can I just add to that? Because I don't think it's not just that you hadn't understood the three. That was not communicated to the school committee, to the community. And we talked about the need to be sustainable with the,
sustainable within our limits.
to arrive at the number that would allow us to sustain the operations. And then the school committee, has been working hard to stay within what was approved, right? So I just think this is a very important point that will need to have a lot of care and attention in communicating out.
Yeah.
Because it is the reality. So there's no change in the reality of what the numbers are.
So that's the point I was trying to make,
Yeah,
about, like the definition of reasonable. I mean, around this table, right? Like I have a daughter right now sitting in the first grade classroom at Tucker, the French immersion program. There are 28 kids with just one teacher, right? Like I get how what we're talking about, the assumption will make all of that worse for kids who have far more needs than my kid has, right? But just to, we do need thought partnership to try to understand where we can go given the extreme I think these are extreme circumstances that we've all been put into. And quite honestly, when we were all running last spring, I mean, this is the dollar figure for the override that was set. You know, I was greatly concerned that this was level service because, you know, there is natural growth that has been baked in. Everything was already to the bone, right? And given the national climate, like this is what I was afraid of is starting to come to fruition, and that we would need to have strong collaboration to creatively problem solve in a sustainable way, because we can't, or we need several years before we can go back out again and ask the taxpayers for more funds.
Agreed.
And we are in an incredibly, I mean, I think everyone at this table right now is bearing the brunt of decisions made before we were all in leadership positions, that we don't really have sustainable revenue sources. And, you know, we're in the constraint of the property tax levy that we're in.
Yeah.
So that's my long-winded way of saying, like, I feel the same. I feel the same sense of concern that everyone else here feels.
So in my thinking is that given this is where we are, and given that this number is a substantial number for the schools to approach in any 1 year,
Yep.
our budget philosophy as a school committee and a school department was to be fiscally sustainable
Yep.
and responsible. Like we are partnering with you in that mode of we need to really be careful about how we grow or how we utilize our resources, and how we actually didn't put in any growth. We just, the 5.2 was really just a rollover.
Oh, yeah.
That was what was asked. So
Yep.
That's all we did. And we actually reduced positions this year in order to make sure that we could fund our own
Absolutely.
special education
Yep.
stabilization within the district. So,
Yep.
but within that partnership of trying to find out where the sustainable sweet spot is
Yeah.
for the schools, we're going to have to use a pretty blunt instrument to get up to par with this. And then whatever that leaves for the fiscal 28, fiscal 29. So I'm always looking back 1 fiscal, 2 fiscal years,
Okay.
and looking ahead 2 or
Right.
3. I'm just trying to figure out how many years it will take us to get to the point of sustainability.
Yeah.
And also, now that it's January, the instrument that we're going to have to use is pretty blunt in order to get calibrated for this fiscal 27. So my hope is that while we're being thoughtful about it, is there any way to kind of sand down the edges to this to know that for the next 2 or 3 fiscal years, we are going to probably have to reduce? And can we do it in a more thoughtful way? I'm not, because I'm acknowledging the reality of there is a, you know, to next point, there's a small standard of deviation between how much revenue is going to increase over the, there's not that much more revenue coming in.
And we have, so the what I'm concerned about, and I feel like I'm doing a lot of the talking, feel free to jump in. I am concerned about year over year, how long we can go level service plus risk that we have with health insurance, with state aid, and there are a few other factors, but
But this is
how do we
year over year level
navigate?
service. This is This is not year-over-year level service.
Yeah,
Right now, this is not.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what was the expectation when the discussions were had in spring? 'Cause I know John and the note you sent us before was that the schools had grown at about 9 to 10% the last few years. You had been mindful of having this initial ask being about 5%, which is less than the 9% that happened last years. Was the expectation that expenditures would grow at 5% after the override?
Well,
What was
Yeah. I don't know. We collectively said that we were gonna do level service. We rolled the budget over at level service. 5.2 is in the normal range of what public schools would do. Anywhere between 4 to 5 is normal. So we dedicated our work to coming in at that number. And I did not, I did expect some sort of a struggle to get to that, mitigating some expenses, certain places, knowing that we had already did not fill vacancies in order to anticipate that we might need to carry some of that over into fiscal 27. But I don't want to ignore the reality of this is just what the money is. So that's the first thing we all have to acknowledge that. I'm just trying I'm looking at this through a process lens.
Mhm.
I'm also looking at this through a political lens. This is an interesting dynamic to present to the public after rallying the folks. And I can say that I've never been prouder to live in a town that actually took care of business financially than living in this town where a lot of towns didn't. I mean, this is exactly what good towns do. Do you know what I mean?
Mhm.
But I want to make sure that the town understands the realities that we have in addition to the fact that they stepped up and what that actually looks like now moving forward for the next 3 to 5 years. And I think that picture is in that movie, that the beginning of that movie is going to be hard for them to understand.
I think what we're trying to understand too is also at this 2.3%, the impacts is in, if you can share with us your idea of level service and that there were, I think about 15 roles somewhere around there that were not filled that are included to be filled in the original 5% as 3.8, right? So our thinking was if those roles were filled at a lower level, what are the needs for the schools right now? But in hearing that 26 cuts, I don't think any of us would be really happy to have that happen or have to go back to our parents and say, it's not that we're not filling these roles for another year. It's that we're actually going to be cutting 26 educators or, folks that have roles in the schools. So I think we're also trying to find out what the real impact of the scenario is for the schools. Right?
Yeah.
Well, just like Nick, Nick is going to have that hard with Amy, that hard conversation with the departments today at 10 o'clock. We have the same meeting at 11 o'clock. We have also, as Nick and Amy have done some pre-work to kind of figure out what that looks like so we can put it in front of the principal state at 11. And I can tell you that we've already got up to about 1.6 million, and that's about 22 people. And that's inclusive of not filling the vacancies that we had and adding to that list.
Those 15 vacancies are unfilled plus
It's not 15, it was only about 8 or 9.
8 or 9. And then on top of that, people would actually need to be cut.
That's correct. And we're not there yet, and that's fine. We'll get.
We're just thinking about it in terms of just different areas.
Yeah.
And then there.
To be fair on our end, we don't know the practical. We're just learning about the practical implications of all of this.
Yeah, I mean, going back to process timing in the political expectation, I want to make sure that we think together and go out together with a similar. This is where we are. This is we should do that in a way that's helpful. But given it's January 7th, this will be a blunter instrument than normal to get to this budget in time for town meeting. And then in my brain, I'm using this as a 2-year window to try to right size the ship for the Milton Public Schools and to be as aligned as possible with the town revenue. That's the reality in order to make sure that for FY29 that we have, I have 2 budgets left. I have this budget in FY28 in order to make some alignments and reductions in a way that's good for kids.
Yeah.
And that fits within the revenue expectations of the town.
I just want to push back on one element of this in terms of I will leave a lot aside to override. But when I came here in October, I said our expectation is in fiscal 27, the budget's going to increase $4.2 million to 2.9%. So I appreciate frustration at what the impacts might be, but I just want to be clear that that was the message we delivered in October. We delivered that message at the municipal the budget coordination committee that now that the override is done, if we're going to increase at 3% a year, based on what our revenue realities are, I feel like that's a pretty consistent message that we can work on and improve in terms of how it's delivered to this group. I'm happy to share that we sat in this room in October and I gave an overview, and the change that we're talking about from then to now was minimal. So we were right on at that conversation. The caveat that I left in at that time was this does not include the $4.2 million does not include any money from the operating stabilization fund. So
the number today was
it's 4.9 with the 700.
no, but I mean the 700 million is already
now it's included.
concession.
Right.
Yeah.
So and I think, what I just wanted to make sure I stated that piece of it.
That's fair.
And then what would be helpful for us, and you're kind of outlining this, is what 5.2% budget cannot afford that. So where could the school committee come into, or the school department come in at, and kind of resetting it and knowing that the level service is going to happen? What are numbers that mitigate some of these impacts that you've raised, and then we can talk about maybe some strategies we can employ to assist in that as we move forward.
So just for the average, the 9-year average of an increase in schools is about 5.9. And there's been some pretty heavy years there, so that's offsetting that.
That was going to be the question I was going to ask.
Yeah.
It seems like there's perhaps some history, some expectation on percent increases for MPS. Like, how has that traditionally aligned with percent increases for the town departments and the town budget as a whole? That maybe folks may be on different pages with what's the reasonable year over year increase. Like if we're constrained now at 3% increases due to the override on the macro level, like what is actually, it seems like the conversation hasn't yet been had on what is the reasonable increase for MPS, the rate increase year over year in this new environment, because it's been different given the prior environment.
I guess that would be my question. And to John's point, the number is what it is. We fully understand. And there have been years that have been high. And we've all this, there's been a lot of effort to reduce that, to cut, to be very thoughtful with the budget, to be actually less than level service given the positions are being. I think where I'm not understanding, or maybe I missed something, is when we were talking about the 9.5, I'm not sure that we were clear on the assumptions that were being made about the levels, the percent increase or the funding, what the expectation was for that 9.5. So, and now hearing that that 9.5 was using either a 2.5% or a 3% increase to schools. I think where you're saying, Nick, coming in October saying that, I don't think any of us had that understanding if that's where that was.
Yeah.
So doing a lot of work to come in lower than we had, being very cognizant of being fiscally responsible in the budget. I think that 2.5% or 3% and even the 5.4% is a big leap. So I think what you're hearing from us is that wasn't understood.
Yeah.
So given that, I think your question, I think it is what is reasonable moving forward? How do we do that? I think it's just.
Well, Ian's responsible.
And
I think responsible is a big word for me in what I'm hearing.
At some point, would it be helpful? Like, it sounds like, I'm not speaking, but
Sure, yeah.
would it, is part of what you're looking for to better understand what are the drivers of a school budget that increases in the range of 4 to 5%? Like, and why is that? Is that part of like what you're looking to understand? Because I'm sure that, maybe not right now, but
Yeah.
that could be helpful information to share so that you understand what makes a schools department budget a little bit different from another town department.
I think part of
Apparently
it-
the same.
I think it's the same. Yeah.
Everybody has grades, everybody has steps, we all have personnel.
Yeah.
Police and fire and 90% people, it's even greater than the share that, the school department has. The town hall staff is people. It's not any other expense. It's just our costs as employees. DPW budget is the only non kind of people-based budget, which is, trash collection, trash disposal, recycle collection, recycle disposal, everything else. I think they're very similar. So
There are variables, transportation, like there are other things that the schools deal with that the other department.
I think in the end, and I appreciate Nick's offer to, and he said this a couple of times, and I really want to thank him for it, and also emphasize is that where we are is that there needs to be belt tightening in the reality of having a fiscally sound town and schools is to make sure that we're not using one-time revenue to pay for operating and ongoing expenses. So where can we utilize some of those one-time expense chunks like special education reserve fund and other places in order to support the other costs that we're dealing with? I do believe, and the reason why vacancies weren't filled in the schools this year is that I did feel like those accounts needed to have a balance in them to be a responsibly an organization around it. We know that those expenses will be incurred over the course of the year. Balances in those revolving accounts from transportation to special education to athletics. Those are all variable things in having healthy revolving accounts. So we were working on that on our own. We weren't seeking town support. We embedded that into our 5.2 to fix those problems over time ourselves in order not to ask for any big chunks of money to go in. So I'm thinking right now about what our one-time supports we could get in order to support those parts of the budget that we're worried about that do impact the general budget. Because if those accounts are emptied in the middle of a year, then you're reducing folks because you have to be balanced by June 30th.
Right.
So we incorporated all those, reestablishing those accounts within our 5.2. So that's an area of support that Nick could provide support in, or we could think about. And I guess my thinking is, from a practical standpoint, is we will make reductions. They'll be more challenging to do in the timeline that we have in terms of being surgical versus a little bit blunty. But I think this is at least a 2 year conversation. And I do not believe that during that 2 year period, I think it would be helpful for us together collectively to talk about a reasonable percentage increase for a public school system that has 4,100 students, that has an expectation to service as many students as they can in a way that's a high level. Because those expectations are high reducing 30 to 50 people over the next 3 years will be in the opposite direction of what we children. Reducing some of them is going to be, I have a list. I already have a list. That list is not nice, but it's a list that I think we can move through and still meet the needs of students. Anything past that list, I think, would be detrimental to high functioning expectation that it's have. So I am fully aware and fully partnering in this work of trying to be fiscally responsible. And I just want to make sure that, as to your point, Winston, we will be meeting today. We'll be probably have 3 meetings with our leaders to come up with the impact of the reductions and the impact of those reductions. And then that's when people will have a better understanding of what
I think this is the first meeting that we've had together to have this kind of conversation. I don't know if we're final,
Yeah, like
Like
this is just a
the beginning,
first
This is the beginning of it, right?
That's why I say, like, so when we put this together, you'll see.
conversation of, we're in a bad situation,
Because even,
but no final decisions
going
are
through the
made.
free cash balance, were to throw that into the schools, that would leave us with zero to next year,
Yeah.
right? And then we'd be right back at this table having those conversations again. So I think we're trying to talk about sustainability, the impacts, and what are the mitigations that we have at our disposal, not just for this year, but the upcoming years.
Mhm.
And I think we do have also, I think I get your point about messaging and what we say to the town. As tough as that override was, for us to talk about cuts is a really difficult conversation for us to have with our, not just our parents, but also our educators.
Mhm.
So hopeful, and I think the spirit of us sitting here is that all of us want to work this
Yeah.
out
Yeah,
and make this work for the schools in which we are all incredibly invested.
yep,
So I don't take this as the final conversation about anything.
it is, in my opinion, my sentiment, this is just the first conversation. And nothing is set in stone.
John, what's the notification?
April.
So first conversation, but like I feel your sense of urgency, like
Yes.
this has to move
Yeah.
extremely quick.
Yeah, I think that on the school side, first of all, I agree. This is one of many meetings that we should have around the complications of not just the school's budget, but $500,000 on the town side. Is $500,000 on the town side. That's not that's substantial in and of itself as well. So this is not just a school thing, but we will. I have a joint lab management meeting tomorrow with the union. I'll be letting them know exactly what's happening. We are in the middle of a negotiation year. We will need to be and I will be very transparent with our families and our staff that this is our situation. As of right now, this is what we're trying to work through. This needs to be a very public conversation about where we are. There should be no surprises. The public deserves to know exactly what's happening and what the timing is and what efforts that we're making to partner on all this. But this is where we're at. This is what we're starting to work towards, and people need to know. The sooner the later, information is power for them to understand their own situation and what it means. And I think that they deserve to understand what's happening, and this is work that we'll work through. And I think that we will work through it. And I have no doubt that this will not end and it's sustainable for us over time. But I think this will, the almost $2.1 million to reduce starting around January and having done by the end of March, February. We'll take some quick decisions to make it. We'll be thoughtful, and I appreciate the partnering and I appreciate the one-time funding pieces that we can add. And I don't want to contribute to using one-time money to continue to pour into an operating budget.
Yeah.
That just pushes this whole discussion down the road. I understand that from a financial perspective, but there might be years where you need to do a little bit of that to sand down the edges that you're trying to work towards a responsible model. Jimmy, every once in a while, you might need a bump to make things palatable for the community in order to hopefully pick something up on the other side.
And you have our assurances on our ends that we will work with the town administrator to find, we will leave no stone left unturned that we can contribute to narrowing that gap. But we all share a fiduciary responsibility in the out years as well to
agree.
I mean, we have to get out of the cycle that we're in somehow. I don't know how on earth it's possible given the composition of land use in our tax base. Like we are so politically constrained, and I mean, that's a different conversation for a different time. But we all share the burden of minimizing risk in these out years as well.
Yeah,
because we don't want to, we talking about sustainability, it's also like, how do we optimize the staffing to student ratio in the out years as well, so that we don't go too hard this year and end up having to lay off people in the out years or not
What are the out years? The years we're not having an override?
Or if,
That's
or,
almost every
or,
year though.
right.
I mean, we're in the first out year and we're,
Yeah. So for me, I think there are many towns in the Commonwealth that are on sort of a cycle. It's understood that, it's 3 to 5 years, and then you just automatically have an override. Everybody understands. We are not that type of town. And every time, overrides are risk. Like, we are not guaranteed that the electorate will support that. And I would say even it was great that people came out and supported this override, but I personally don't know that it was the right number, right? Given the situation that we're in right now. So, I don't want to be on my soapbox, but for me, this is about making sure that we're also not in another terrible situation in a few years.
I guess, I agree with you that it wasn't the right number. It's clearly not the right number.
We said that at the time.
Yeah, you did say it at the
totally,
time. Yeah.
I just want to note that the request for a higher number was for a higher number to spend in fiscal 26.
Oh,
It
wow.
was the $12 million that had money being spent on personnel in 26. It wasn't a $12 million override with $3 million not being spent for 3 years.
That's not true. We specifically had the conversation of the operating, even the term, the operating budget stabilization fund was to stabilize, it is to stabilize the budget over the period before the next override. This is mitigating the impacts of budget cuts on an annual basis, but it's not stabilizing anything. 26 cuts next year is not stable for students. And so if that number had been larger in terms of what was invested within the operating stabilization fund, so that we could
You
draw
ran
down
into
a larger.
opposition from the school committee on putting $700,000 into the operating budget stabilization in the first place because it meant a reduction in the fiscal 26 budget for the school department. The $12 million override was $3 million more of expenses. It wasn't a $9.5 million override or $3 million being set aside to support budgets in future years. And I don't want to sound offensive. We advise the select board that if the $9.5 million with $700,000 used over the next several years at a 2.5% to 3% cost ratio with 7% health insurance, that is what we saw as manageable. That's what the select board wanted. If that was wrong, I'll eat that. But I don't want us to kind of backtrack to a scenario where the conversation was a $9.5 million override or a $12 million override that we're setting aside some significant recurring amount of money for future years. That was not ever raised as an idea from any group, or was a $12 million override to fund wants and needs in budgets, which it's a different conversation, and also not the alternative that you're asking here for. It's not even structurally allowed under Prop 2.5 either. So
Yeah, but that's not true. I was in your office. We talked about it. Could we increase the amount in order to invest more in roads in year one, and then you reduce that over time, right? You invest more in capital improvements in SY 26, so that then you reduce that $5 million amount, whatever it is, to $3 million the next year, because that money needs to now move into operating stabilization. And there are other ways in which, and again, that decision is beyond us. I know that decision was not fully yours. It was the select boards. We had conversations with the select board at the time. The thing we asked from the school committee side was, I think we're very clear on, is we need to be able to stabilize this. We can't have 26 cuts in a year. If it's a 3% increase, and that was the assumption of what would be a sustainable budget for the schools, that was a bad assumption. It's apparently a bad assumption for the town too, right? The town needing 3.56%. So that is not sustainable. It is where it is. I don't know how we get to a place, but the only mechanism I can see that ultimately gets us to a place where we're not cutting on an annual basis and creating significant disruption to our school system, if not also to other town departments, is to have these mechanisms within the operating stabilization fund or within capital improvements that then draws down over time, that allows you to push more funds and have increases that are greater than 2.3%. I mean, our transportation increase on an annual basis is 10%, because that's what the one bidder put through. a 2.3% increase for special education. You don't see that anywhere. Like that's not sustainable. And again, I'm sure there are situations like this on the town side as well. So, I do think, to John's point of maybe this is a multi-year thing, but like, how do we figure out a way in which we can not have to come in on an annual basis with cuts? The warrant committee conversations are like, what do you need from the police? Like, let's talk to these folks on, like, I don't think they have a sense that there's just no chance of any ads over the next 5 years. It's just going to be not even just level service, but significant cuts for 5 years until we can get to another override amount. That is a really daunting, I think, task for the town as a whole, much less, again, the impact that this is going to have on kids. So I think a lot of this is tied into the work we're trying to do on the long-term budget projections so that we can see what it is and we can figure out mechanisms that help us sustain a percent increase that is greater than, again, I know this is a little bit of an outlier because of health insurance this year, but even again, a 3% is going to be a cut budget on an annual basis for kids.
But within the conversations that you're saying that were had, I'm hearing a really big number in growth year over year, but we know our revenue is not growing at that. So in the conversations leading up to the override, you're saying it's special education is increasing at 10%. 5% is like the baseline standard for schools. We know our revenue is not increasing at that level. So we knew at some point that this was not going to match, right? If we're already at a minimum 9.5 behind in need of an override, we were not going to have, and even looking at the numbers, there has been a huge jump in revenue in the last 3 years. And even with that, and Nick saying that was factored at 7% health insurance increase. We're looking at a minimum of 10 this year, which is a possibility coming into this. We were thinking it might be 14 or 16%. Those are massive jumps for us. So we knew revenue was never, even at baseline, revenue was never going to get to the need for the schools. So where was the disconnect in that conversation to hack? I think what we're trying to do right now is connect some of our sins of the past. And unfortunately, what we're all trying to do is not make sure that all the kids in the schools right now are not the ones that bear the burden.
Winston, I think what I'm hearing is, I don't think a lot of people around this table thought the override number was enough. Okay. I just don't think we thought it would show up like this in year one. I mean, I don't know. I wasn't in the conversation, but like that's what
But
I'm
we
hearing.
did those projections. I think, Nick, in the presentation, there were the projections of if we are here at 9.5, this is where, and I think it was around 28 was when we sort of we're going to struggle 4 years, right? And that's at the 7% increase, which we're saying now is going to be a little higher. So even at 12, we were going to put that into the schools right away. And whatever the disagreement is there, it just seems that, Mark, to your point, like we are where we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think what we're all trying to walk away from this table is, okay, what do we do to lessen the impact? And to John's point about operationally putting into what the schools know about our revenue projections and what we can have and do in the next year.
Yeah, I just think it's not, this is like both SY27 and the impacts, but also we just can't be here again cutting another 20 people in SY28. And so like, what do we need to cut in SY27 to then put more money in the operating stabilization fund to be able to have a larger percent projected increase on an annual basis that's above 2.3%? Like, what is the system in which we can do where we can get a 3.5%, a 4% increase targeted for the schools on an annual basis so we can sustain whatever that per level of program is.
So we squad. Yeah.
Right? Like, that's what we want. Like, we want predictability for our staff and for our families and for our kids on this is the level of program that we can sustain in Milton Public Schools.
Mm-hmm.
Again, unless some economic situation comes up. And we understand, like, health insurance comes up, and that means that we're going to have to cut a little bit. Like, that's on an annual basis. Those are conversations we can have. A $2 million, the cost driver here of $2 million cut to the schools is not caused solely by health insurance, right? That is a systemic issue in how we are projecting and dealing with kind of revenue forecasts. And so I think for me, it's, again, just how do we fix this both for FY27, but also for long term, so we're not over the next 5 years needing to cut 12, 15, 20 people every year in order to get down to this 2.5%. I would rather I don't want to cut anybody, but again, I think it would be better for the system. John said this before, is we don't need an A+ budget every year. We need like a B budget. And so like, what is the number that we need to cut to get to a B budget where we know from Katie's projections that we need at least 4%. And so if we can get there and we can put extra money into operating stabilization or some other mechanism that will allow us to sustain over the next 5 years till our next operating budget or override a 4% increase. Like, to me, that is the ideal of how we get out of here moving forward.
I agree with you, by the way.
So I think that this is a new conversation in some ways, because usually, I know Leroy's been working together since 1990s around stuff like this within the town of Milton. It has always been the experience that the override has normally been able to push over into the revenue to the point where we were looking at sustaining and maybe potentially adding a couple more people and doing what the schools need or what the town needs. This is kind of the first time where an override's been exercised and accomplished. And in the first year, it's been a result of being in the red in the first year out. So a lot of what we're talking about is the same conversations we've had for 25 years.
Mhm.
That every town that's a suburban town with limited tax base, that has quality schools, that have high expenses related to being around the city of Boston, et cetera. This is the same conversation that's probably happening in Westwood right now, in Needham right now. I know it's happening in Brookline. You know what I mean? So these conversations are relatively historically kind of the push and pull of what's good for schools, what's good for kids, how can the town afford it? Usually it means it's all about FTEs, it's sustaining a level that's acceptable to producing a product for our families. But so we can work around that. What is different is that in year one, there's such a big gap in order to kind of, that this just didn't connect in a way that I think the general public would think that it would, because it always has connected. The override always did connect the budget back to a sustainable place.
Yeah.
So if in fact that means that the schools needs to reduce, which it will over time, to Mark's point, it would be nice to be able to, what I would call, kind of approach that in a thoughtful 2 or 3 year way, as opposed to a heavy-handed 1 year way.
Yeah.
And I guess that's my way of saying that anything we can do to make that 2.1 go to 1.6 or 1.8 or 1.5, so we can, because I think next year we will be in this spot, but we'll have 1 more year's worth of experience of fine-tuning and realigning resources in a way that we think best serves the kids, and just do it in a more thoughtful way over time, as opposed to in any 1 year having to, like last year was a nightmare circumstance. 72 people, big blunt instrument. You know what I mean? Our goal on the school side is to be able to lead the district in a way that's fiscally sustainable, because we can't plan strategically for what's good for students in teaching and learning unless we know we have the funding in order to operate the level of staffing and program that we need in order to deliver. So there is no long-range planning without long-range planning.
Mhm.
There's no long-range planning with less than adequate level of service funding. So right now we're working on year to year what's best with the funds that we have. And I think that over the next 3 fiscal years, we're going to need to be able to right size the district and convince the public that right sizing still presents a good product for children.
Mhm.
That will be the hard part while we right size. So,
Mhm.
and also we have to be a balance between fiscally responsible to the people at the table and also advocates for teaching and learning and for our kids and our families. The people that went out and voted for the 9.5 were probably 87% families of students in the town. So there's a balance here that we have to strike. I think that we will do it. And I appreciate the thoughtful partnership with this, but this will be an interesting spring.
Getting to time here. Other questions?
So do we have any, so what's the next step as far as getting to, when I'm, looking at ways that we can, as John just said, lessen the impact using one-time funds for either stabilization funds or
capital, like where, what's the process?
Yeah, I think it'll be helpful to know. We know the budget is including trying to build back your reserves. So, what is the actual number that you're leaning on in 27 to help build back your reserves? And are there other sources that we can use to support that effort?
Yeah.
Because we're doing it on the downside. We're putting
Yes.
700 grand is the general stabilization for the dire economic crisis situation. We hope never happens, but I would look at free cash in a similar way. If it helps build up reserves, then it should build up reserves, whether that's townwide or school-wide. I think a broader policy discussion of the select board and others is that operating budget stabilization fund. While I am recommending and you're comfortable with using $700,000, should that number be higher? Are folks comfortable with that, and with a greater withdrawal just means that potentially less money available for 28 and beyond. But the obvious corollary there is does free cash go to offset some of that? So if it's $900,000 this year and then put in $600,000 into the operating budget stabilization fund to make that last a couple of years. So I think those two conversations would be helpful. And then some of these other elements are just allow a little bit out of our control and timing. So finalizing some of the revenue stuff over the next couple of weeks. So I think those are the three kind of main points is, from a building back reserves perspective, what's happening there, or are there other, one-off costs in your budget? We're doing the same homework on our budget. The broader operating budget stabilization fund conversation. So it's just what happens with some of our revenue. And like I alluded to, I think there might be a couple places where we're able to tweak some of these shared costs. We're not talking about savings, maybe $1,000 at most. So, and maybe post $100,000. So that's what we're going to revisit on next couple of weeks. I can probably provide another update or a check-in in 2 weeks if that would be helpful, and then we can do some work offline.
And then one thing to that, clear picture of impacts for the schools if we were to stay at this time.
I agree. So we'll start today with the mark of about $2 million of reductions, and we'll try to put that over the next 3 weeks in a prioritized order. And we will work with Nick and Amy around what are some of the one-time pieces that suggest that might be helpful to put aside, i.e. mainly special ed stabilization fund would be very helpful for us to have that those funds in that town account just in case something happened. That would be a break the glass thing. It wouldn't be able to be using for operations. It would be kind of a security blanket that we would have, so we wouldn't have to put as much into those revolving funds as we normally would. So, but we'll come up with $2 million worth of reductions. We'll let the community know what the impact is, and we'll also let them know that we're all working together to try to minimize that over the next 2 months. I think the same thing that you have doing on the other side.
Yeah.
Katie, did you have anything to add?
I just want to clarify too for the special ed stabilization fund, even if that fund, even if there is money in the fund, the intent of the fund is really to just offset one-time costs that were unbudgeted that come up during the fiscal year. But those costs don't go away. Those costs are students. And so that cost, it's offset one time, but then it has to.
It's recurring.
Yeah.
It's a reinforcement. Yes. Yes.
So by shifting it, and it's certainly a mechanism that we can use, but it really is just shifting it to offset that one-time cost. And then in the next fiscal year, we'll see things.
Yeah.
So if we're cutting the budget, but have a corresponding default impact in the kind of like years out. So I just want to make sure that everybody's kind of.
And to shine a little bit brighter light on that account, we started the FY 26 going to be $8,000 in the account that by state guidance should be 3.1. So the reason why we did not fill vacancies was to free out our own security and balance into that account in order to plan for the worst and hope for the best. So we're not starting with the average revolving account number that we would feel comfortable with kind of jockeying with a little bit up and down. Jim was starting with a very substantial deficit in that account that we're internally trying to benefit by, but to Kate's point, once it gets into the system, it's a reoccurring expense. And that money in that account would require both the select board and the school committee. It wouldn't be for us to use operationally under certain circumstances. But we are starting, that's why we have prioritized our revolving accounts this year. We are trying to cultivate our own security and our own fiscal stability within the school budget as part of the larger picture of being a small town budget.
So tonight discussion, but I know we're meeting, this finance meeting next week, you should be meeting internally this week, ongoing. We anticipate you can get together in 2 weeks and 3 weeks, so you know that we can do that internal stuff.
I'm available as kind of would be helpful. So we don't have to decide necessarily here now.
Yeah, I'm available whenever we need to be able to talk about this. And I also wanted to just say out loud that once we meet with principals, and this is an open dialogue now.
Yeah.
This is what it is. So I'll be letting my leadership team know that we're going to be working towards this, the larger leadership team. And my strategy would be to also to let our staff know that this is a discussion, and families should know that this is a discussion. So I'm not sure everyone else's comfortability with that, but I plan on sending something out to the staff tomorrow, as well as to the community, that our fiscal situation has been shifted and that we're willing to do this work, but this is the gap. I just think it benefits everybody to be aware.
I would agree.
Great. I say that openly so I don't feel like I'm letting the families know, and you say, why didn't you say that to me before I left that meeting on Wednesday?
No, I appreciate
I
that.
just want to be open about how strategically we should approach this in a way that is open and transparent. And that's what we're trying to do this year.
Yeah, that's our school committee meeting. So,
Yeah.
Yeah. So, just.
Yes. This is great.
And you're thinking of that being the town side, are we sending this out as a joint dispatch, or is this something for the schools?
We'll probably talk about it at our meeting next week.
I appreciate the partnership. I appreciate the clarity in the goals.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Of course. Just for us, and now next meeting, it's next Wednesday, 14th. Same place, budget, still enough time. We had the 21st down as a conversation on the revolving funds policy. More budget. Sort of back together, but we can.
Yeah.
We'll have both of those on calls.
Yeah, we'll do the Q2. So
Right.
Q2 is looking good, by the way. Good news.
Okay. Any other new business that you need to discuss or add for your future agenda? I will take a motion to adjourn. Second. All in favor? Adjourned. Thank you.